Right, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait for another half minute or so before we make a start. We've got quite a tight schedule, but as there are a large number of people registered for this, we'll wait for 30 seconds or so before making a start. All right, everyone. Look, perhaps we'll make a start now. Numbers are kind of static just at the moment, so we'll let people join as they can. My name's David Eckstein. I'm a lecturer equity programs at Deakin University, and it's my great pleasure to be here with you today with Rachel Barron. Rachel and I have been working together for the last 2-3 years, and really pleased to be able to help with this discussion about Rachel's practice. I would like to start with a brief acknowledgement of country. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Boonwurrung, more specifically the Aliquid Willem, who are the river people of what we now call Port Phillip, and I acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, as well as Indigenous friends and colleagues who are joining us today. Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you in a sec, but before I do, just a note about the order of proceedings. We're going to have a 10-minute presentation from Rachel, and then we will be breaking out for 25 minutes of discussion. And we have 4 or 5 of us who are able to help facilitate those discussions, but most of you will be without facilitators. So we're going to ask you to nominate someone to report back 1 or 2 key points from your discussions when we debrief for 10 minutes at the end of today. But for now, I will hand over to Rachel, who has got some very interesting and I think very enabling thoughts about WIL and students with disabilities. So Rachel, over to you.
Great. Thank you, David. And I just want to acknowledge David while he is chairing today. Certainly his work has been informing my learning, and I acknowledge that also he's been a critical friend in helping me articulate my practice that I've had for some time, but probably not situated it within any particular theories, but I've started to do that. So I think we started some time back about 3 years ago, and David presented his NESHI fellowship work, which has also formed a basis of the larger discussion today. So I'm talking about facilitating a student-led agency and how do we do that? And I wanted to talk to some of my own practice, I guess, today, and as a WIL practitioner, and I wanted to draw on a range of resources that are in my toolkit to talk about the case of John, who is on a learning access plan. Just a couple of comments about myself so you have some context about where I'm coming from. Certainly, I studied a Bachelor of Applied Science many years ago in intellectual disability and worked in that space as a personal care attendant for quite a few years, up to about 10 years. I come with about 25 years in higher education, working across a range of professional academic roles. And I guess I ground my learning in supporting the individual through experiences that are situated in quite a complex world, or a globalized world of work that's quite complex. My experiences are certainly shaped by the belief that the student is central to the learning, and including their perspectives is certainly vital to success. So I certainly come with also a cultural lens and thinking about a range of transitions that perhaps students go through. In the last 10 years, I've come into the area of work integrated learning, and I'm hoping that this picture that I've got here really demonstrates the complexity and the multidisciplinary nature that work integrated learning is, and I'm sure many colleagues here today would recognise that as well. As David indicated, my idea is to get through this in about 10 minutes. So I will work quite quickly. And I will be sharing mostly really a case study and referring then into, I guess, my toolkit of resources that articulate some of the principles that I work to in my practice in working with students. So firstly, the will and institutional context very quickly. I'm a subject coordinator of work-based learning subjects and the industry placement minor. It's a suite of university-wide electives that students from a range of those sort of very large non-vocational courses can access, particularly when they don't have placement subjects in their degree. They can do up to 4 subjects. Each subject has a hurdle requirement of 100 hours of placement, so they can do up to 400 hours of placement. Many students choose to do these longer placements. So the particular student I'm going to talk today, who's John, who's not his real name, obviously, it was completing a longer 200-hour placement. These are very immersive experiences in 6-week terms. So students doing about 2 days a week. And there is a placement application process that we have where I've been significantly involved in trying to get students to disclose early so that we can support them to fully participate and maximise their learning on placement as well. The subject curriculum, I will say lastly, also requires early discussions with, I guess, our learning discussions with supervisors about their goals in the workplace. That's really important. That's very early in week 2. So the case of John, who's just about to commence a long placement of 2 hours. He's a Bachelor of Science student majoring in microbiology, and he's commencing a placement starting in that 6-week term. He's managed to secure a university source placement. So we're working with industry placement staff or industry engagement staff, I should say, in the university, and they've managed to source a placement which he has applied for and been successful in obtaining, which was fabulous, I should say. John decided to share his learning access plan. Many of you will have different names, but it's those sort of educational access plans that students have around a range of mental health and disability and neurodiversity diagnoses. So those plans that facilitate their educational access. So he shared that plan with me on the Friday before the term started. This is after he's been successful in obtaining his placement. I reviewed what I called a learning access plan or LAP plan to see what adjustments might facilitate his educational access. And at that point, there's no mention of a workplace accommodation. So at that point, it felt like, or it feels like, it felt like a minefield. And I'm, as a practitioner, as a subject coordinator, these are the questions that are really going through my head. What is my role? Do I have time for this? It's the Friday before teaching commences, trying to get students and work with students on those last minute things, which is sort of common, I guess, in our space, those of you working as subject coordinators and even those of you supporting subject coordinators in their roles. The content of the learning access plan, is it facilitating educational or is it also facilitating workplace access is the question. It's a longer 2-hour placement. Will his condition fluctuate? And as I read his learning access plan, that also concerned me as well. And then what about the industry supervisor? So these are the things that were running through my head, and I hope the picture demonstrates that quite clearly. So maybe many of you have seen this kind of, I guess, picture. It's that Venn diagram showing the multiple connections that we have in will, and will sitting, I guess, in that middle, those connections between that tripartite relationship really between the student, the subject coordinator and the industry supervisor. And then I've got that larger circle, which I hope is representing, a whole range of systems and processes, the institution, society, the environment, etc., in that larger circle there. So there were a number of questions I started to have, and I'm just going to run through these. What does the industry supervisor need? What does the student expect or need from me? That was probably my first question, and then I started to think about what does the industry supervisor need? How can I work and facilitate the student's perspective? How can I facilitate their learning, given that they've just told me about their learning access plan? The other questions I had, well, is the student asking me to fix this for them? What's in the content of their learning access plan? And, how important is it for the supervisor to know? I was certainly thinking at that point, I thought it was important for the supervisor to know. What is the student not saying? So have they had some past experiences that perhaps haven't been positive? Are they worried about discrimination? Those sorts of things. And I think past experiences play a lot into this. And then I started to look at, well, what's the impact of the relationship? What are the risks to the student's relationship with the supervisor, the university's relationship with the organisation? So I started to have a range of these, different thoughts and ideas there. And I think the last thing there, did I have one more? And how will the supervisor respond, given that they didn't really know they didn't really know about this up front as well? And does that matter as well? And I think, this is quite a complex scenario, and I probably haven't mentioned everything here, but you're starting to get a sense of all the questions that are going through my head and how do I manage this? And so I guess what I then embarked on was an email conversation where I started to, have that conversation and unpack that discussion around what the student need to have a discussion with. So I was trying to think about, well, what's on your learning access plan, John? What is important for you to discuss? Is it important for you to discuss with your supervisor? Have you raised it with your supervisor? Why haven't you raised it with your supervisor? Did this carried on over a number of days? And I think in the end, I had a fairly good outcome, which was fabulous. So in terms of summing up, and I'm just looking at we're going okay with time. So in summing up, I wanted to talk about, the influences that play on career decision-making as part of the WIL experience. And I guess I'm referring to some colleagues or some literature here from Pat and McMahon who talk about systems theory of career development learning. So a range of things are at play about why the student may or may not be talking to their industry placement supervisor. Do they know about the difference between educational and workplace accommodations? Do they understand disclosure? Have they had bad experiences in the past with disclosure? So these situations too, I think I wanted to acknowledge, as a subject coordinator, these situations are often underrated or hidden career development learning, that CDL, career development learning within the WIL experience as well. So sometimes, as a subject coordinator, we end up in these type of more mentoring roles, and that certainly was my experience. If and when is the right time to disclose for the student as opposed to the institutional WIL processes? So that question around the timing. We were hoping they disclose earlier. That certainly, I think, makes it easier to have those really good discussions, which is what I was intending to do, or which I did, to raise those issues that might be impacting on why they're not talking about, or why the student's not talking about it. Making time for those career development dialogues with students. And as I mentioned, as a subject coordinator, how can we have those timely, transparent and meaningful, conversations and that talk about the interconnectedness of the placement experience and the importance for building that rapport and relationship and what the workplace can and can't do in terms of accommodating, as long as they choose to disclose. I think I mentioned before, educational versus workplace accommodations. How do we support students' awareness and understanding? So when the student approached me, he certainly approached me with a learning access plan that only had that educational access. There was nothing there about workplace access. So I started to have a conversation about, well, you know, perhaps some of the things that were in your educational access that you needed accommodations for, you may also need accommodations for in the workplace. And we started to unpack that and talk that through. And I think the conversation at the end was he did talk to his supervisor, I think, which was I think very useful. Consideration of multiple stakeholders during the will experience before, during and after placement. And certainly Billet talks about that before, during and after placement. Certainly, I think in this particular case scenario, I was working with him before and at the start of placement, working with John around that disclosure issue, around accommodating that, and having those conversations to allow him then to take action and work through this himself, based on, I guess, some support and discussion from me. Is the process as important as accommodations provided? So is the process of disclosure, I should have put there, important as the accommodations provided? And our colleagues in Ontario in Canada, some recent literature suggests it is absolutely important, certainly in Canada. So we'll wait to see how this happens in Australia. But I note that perhaps the process, certainly in my institution, could improve in terms of clarity, both for students in understanding the difference between workplace and educational access, and also for staff in terms of managing that. So I guess I just wanted to finalise and summarise, I guess, some sort of practice principles that I operate that I think support student agency going forward, and I'm hoping that they may be useful for you. There's certainly things that I've reflected on over a long time, and certainly come, I think, with my background working in, you know, first international education, or worked in disability work, then international education, then working in large student leadership and student mentoring programs. So the first one I really seek to do is WIL is about supporting students beyond just graduating. So I'm really seeking for them to become career and life capable. So I'm looking at long-term solutions that will really help students and practice for their future. So it's important that they start to learn, I guess, to negotiate those accommodations and to understand how to do that with support while they're at university. I'm really wanting to, I'm really wanting to work with students to facilitate dialogue and learning about those transitions and their agency. And that can be really tricky, as I indicated. You know, it's the Friday before, I'm feeling really pressured. Do I have time to do this? And this is when, you know, you call on people such as critical friends like David, who, you know, you're in a rush, you're trying to do many things at one time. And, you know, having those supporters there, I think, is really useful to help you in a busy period really frame, you know, is this what I want to do? It is important to have that conversation and to validate that. And so those critical supporters and friends around you become very important in those busy times we all have as subject coordinators and in the lead up to the start of semester and term. I also see my role as a cultural interpreter and supporting students' learning, as I said, longer term. So cultural interpreter in terms of, you know, transitioning into the workplace. Understanding the intersections between will, employability and career development learning. As I have the longer I'm involved in teaching, I think the longer I've seen the value of seeing the intersection between those three things. I think initially I only thought about work integrated learning and employability, but certainly have started to think much more about career development learning and how does that have those sorts of frames around, you know, Pat McMahon's work, their impact on my role as a student coordinator, trying to mentor and support students transition to the workplace. I've kept reading about diversity inclusive will, and thank God for the International Journal of Will, which I'm sure many of you will know. They have some great material in there about diversity and inclusive access, and we know that's all big on the agenda at the moment. Consider how your WIL curriculum and assessment can facilitate dialogues between students and industry early. So I'm really looking at those ideas around learning plans and goals, which we know are very common assessments in placement subjects and even in other types of models of WIL as well. Know your institutional processes and those processes working with students with a disability and who your supporters are. As I said, you know, those critical friends, the learning access advisors, your career advisors, who can help you to try and get those messages across during that WIL life cycle, before, during and after. And I think lastly, keep reflecting on how processes could be better. I'm thinking about, you know, how could we incorporate disclosure and accommodation information into induction processes? How can I better work with the accessibility and learning advisors? And how can I guess, work more with the careers advisors too? And there are a range of other things I'm sure that you as practitioners out there are probably thinking as well. I put a list of resources there, and I've mentioned most of those today. And I think at this point, I hope that I've given you lots of food for thought, and I'm going to hand over to David. David?
All righty. Look, Rachel, thank you very much. And we're going to move to breakout rooms now, because we'd like to consider these questions from your perspectives and what you do to support student-led disclosure and how you deal with issues and the kinds of support that you get from your particular operational context, and what is it that actually helps student-led disclosure that informs their decision to either share or not share in a way that is going to help them. So I'll assign you to breakout rooms now. As I mentioned before, there are 4 or 5 of us who are available to facilitate conversation in those breakout rooms. If you don't have a facilitator, please nominate one, so that when we debrief in about 25 minutes time, when we come together as a group, you can tell us 1 or 2 key thoughts from your discussions. So just give me a minute while